On the morning of April 7, 1945, somewhere over the Pacific, more than 100 American fighter pilots were flying toward a destination no American fighter pilot had ever reached. They were flying toward Tokyo, not the outskirts, not the coast, Tokyo itself. The question everyone was asking, every general, every bombardier, every man in Washington who'd studied the maps, was not whether these pilots were brave enough. They had already proved that. The question was far simpler and far more brutal. Could a single-engine propeller fighter survive a round trip of over 1,300 miles across open ocean, arrive over the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific, fight for its life, and then fly home again? 8 hours, over water, with no margin for error. The answer would determine whether the air war over Japan could be won at all. To understand what these men were being asked to do, you have to go back 1 month, and you have to understand how desperate the situation had become. By early 1945, the American strategic bombing campaign against Japan was in serious trouble. B-29 superfortresses flying out of the Mariana Islands had been hammering Tokyo and its surrounding industrial targets, and the results were, to put it plainly, embarrassing. The tactics imported wholesale from Europe, high-altitude, daytime precision bombing, were failing catastrophically. Over coastal Japan, jet stream winds at 30,000 feet were so violent that bombs routinely fell miles from their targets. Entire missions, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of gallons of fuel, the lives of crews, all of it thrown at targets they were barely scratching. General Curtis LeMay, the hard-edged commander overseeing the campaign, tore the playbook up entirely. He dropped his bombers to low altitude and switched to incendiary raids at night, targeting the dense urban areas of Japanese cities where war production was dispersed into civilian workshops and small factories. The results were devastating. On the night of March 9, 1945, American bombers incinerated 16 square miles of Tokyo. 100,000 people died in a single night. 25% of the city was reduced to ash. But even that wasn't enough. A handful of large hardened industrial targets remained standing. The Nakajima Aircraft Factory, precision-built facilities that were producing the very fighter planes now shooting down American bombers. Night area bombardment couldn't touch them. High-altitude raids couldn't hit them. The only solution was daytime, low-altitude precision bombing. And that meant the bombers would be flying directly into the teeth of Japan's fighter defense in broad daylight with no protection, unless someone could get fighters to Tokyo. The problem seemed almost insoluble. The nearest American-held airfield, even theoretically within range of the Japanese mainland, was Iwo Jima, and Iwo Jima was only in American hands because 7,000 Marines had to take it. Even from Iwo, the math was brutal. Tokyo was 650 miles away. That meant a 1,300-mile round trip over the open Pacific. No landmarks, no emergency fields, no second chances. A pilot who lost his engine didn't limp to an alternate airfield. He went into the ocean. The aircraft selected for this impossible assignment was the P-51 Mustang. In Europe, it had already rewritten the rules of the air war. A long-range escort fighter that could fly with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and still have the speed and agility to destroy anything the Luftwaffe sent at it. But this was not Europe. The 2 units selected for the mission, the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, began arriving on Iwo Jima in the first days of March 1945. The island they landed on was barely recognizable as ground that men could inhabit. One pilot later wrote that upon his arrival, he was struck by the total absence of vegetation, every tree and shrub obliterated by weeks of naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. Partially buried Japanese soldiers lay in the volcanic soil. The air smelled of sulfur. And critically, the fighting was not yet over. While American Marines continued hunting the last Japanese holdouts in an underground labyrinth of tunnels beneath the island, the pilots set up their tents on the north side of Airfield No. 2 and tried to prepare for what lay ahead. On the night of March 26, 1945, they got their first taste of combat. It was not in the air. Shortly after midnight, the last surviving Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima launched its final desperate charge. Several hundred soldiers, some armed only with swords and grenades, overran the pilot encampments, screaming "Banzai" into the darkness. By the time Marine reinforcements arrived and the attack was suppressed, 14 men were dead. Most of them were pilots from the 21st Fighter Group, killed in their sleeping bags on the ground they had come to fight from before they had flown a single escort mission. The men who survived wanted blood. They would have to wait. On April 1st, the P-51s were sent on their first long-range training flight, a relatively modest run from Iwo down to Saipan, barely half the distance to Tokyo, designed to shake out the navigation procedures and get the pilots comfortable with long over-water flying. It was meant to be a confidence builder. Instead, it exposed something alarming. Less than half of the aircraft completed the flight. Mechanical failures cascaded through the formation, engines cutting out, fuel systems malfunctioning, radios going dead. Aircraft were turning back, diverting, and limping into Saipan with problems that never would have appeared on a runway in England. The culprit was Iwo Jima itself. The island's volcanic ash, fine as talcum powder and corrosive as sand, was infiltrating every system on every aircraft. Machine gun mechanisms were jamming at rates far higher than anything seen in Europe. Engine components were fouling, and in a unit where engine failure over the Pacific meant a near-certain death by drowning, by capture, or simply by disappearing without a trace, this was not an acceptable failure rate. There was no time to fix it. The bombers needed escorts. Ready or not, the Tokyo Club, as these pilots had already taken to calling themselves, would fly. April 7, 1945. The mission was a daytime strike on the Nakajima aircraft factory. Over 100 Japanese interceptors were scrambled to meet the incoming B-29 formation. They had done this many times before against superfortresses that flew without fighter cover, and they knew exactly how to press home their attacks. What they did not know, what no Japanese pilot over Tokyo had ever seen, was what was waiting for them at altitude. When the P-51s appeared off the coast of Japan and linked up with the bomber formation, the reaction among Japanese pilots was described later as shock. For the first time in the war, the B-29s were not alone, and the fighters flying beside them were faster than anything the Japanese had scrambled, flown by pilots with combat experience that most of the Japanese interceptors simply could not match. At approximately 10:40 in the morning, the first massive air battle over Tokyo began. It was over quickly, and it was not close. The Mustangs tore into the Japanese formations with a ferocity driven by weeks of frustration, by 14 dead friends, by the memory of that night on the airfield. Major Jim Top, leading the 78th Squadron, personally shot down 4 Japanese aircraft, 3 single-engine fighters and 1 twin-engine interceptor in a single engagement, establishing himself as the top scorer of the Tokyo Club in their very first fight. Across the sky, the kill tallies mounted. When the Mustangs finally broke off and turned for home, having exhausted their time over the combat area, the score was tallied back on Iwo. 26 confirmed kills, 2 P-51s lost, 1 to a catastrophic compressibility event, 1 to engine trouble, not a single loss to enemy fire. And of the 400 B-29s that had crossed the Japanese coast, only 3 were gone, 2 to flak, 1 to a Japanese phosphorus bomb. The impossible mission had worked on its very first attempt. But Japan was not finished, and neither were the costs. 5 days later, on April 12th, fuel miscalculations forced many Mustangs to abort before they even reached Japan. Those who pressed on met another furious Japanese defense. In the chaos of that second engagement, a wingman named Fred White was flying so close behind his squadron leader, Major Top, who was in the process of shooting down his 5th kill and becoming the unit's first ace, that a spent shell casing from Top's guns was sucked directly into White's engine air scoop. His engine seized. He went over the side. His parachute failed. He fell into the Pacific and was gone. Those who made it back to Iwo Jima had almost nothing left in their tanks. Reports later confirmed that several Mustangs arrived over the airfield with fuel gauges reading empty. One pilot's engine died as his wheels touched the runway. He coasted to a stop and sat there in the sudden silence, realizing how precise the margin had been. Minutes either way, and he would have been in the ocean with everyone else. This was the arithmetic of the Tokyo Club. Every element had to be perfect: fuel, weather, navigation, engine performance, timing. Any one of them could kill you in ways that had nothing to do with the enemy. As April turned to May and the missions continued, the tactical picture sharpened. Japanese radar and communications were, compared to what the American pilots had trained to expect, almost primitive. Unlike Britain's tightly integrated air defense network, which by 1940 had already developed the ability to vector fighter groups with precision onto incoming raids, the Japanese Army and Navy fighter groups defending Tokyo operated almost entirely independently of each other, with no effective coordination and poor radar coverage. American intelligence exploited this ruthlessly. The Mustangs came away from the Yokohama raid on a May morning with 28 confirmed kills against a single loss, their greatest single day of the war. But inside the success, something else was accumulating, a quiet, grinding toll. The surgeon for the entire unit on Iwo Jima was Lieutenant Colonel Joseph "Smokey" Walther, and Smokey was watching his pilots deteriorate in ways that never showed up in after-action reports. The 8 to 9 hour missions, crammed into a cockpit barely large enough to shift your weight, were physically destroying men who were already running on adrenaline and poor sleep. It became routine, not occasional, routine, for ground crews to physically lift pilots out of their cockpits after landing. The men could not climb down on their own. And they were drowning, not during combat, afterward. Pilots who survived being shot down over the Pacific were dying before rescue aircraft could reach them because their standard-issue life vests were failing. Smokey investigated and discovered that half of the CO2 bottles in the unit's life vests were defective. A man who went into the Pacific trusting his vest to keep him afloat had roughly even odds of sinking instead. He got the vests fixed. Pilot drownings fell. Then he bribed a unit of Seabees, combat engineers who had sustained some of the heaviest casualties on the island, with liquor from the squadron's medical supply. Their assignment: builds the Tokyo Club a proper bathhouse. Iwo Jima sat on volcanic hot springs, and Smokey Walther intended to use them. The pilots returning from Tokyo, barely able to walk off their aircraft, would soak in hot water heated by the same geology that had made the island so costly to take. It wasn't England, but it was something. None of it was enough to prevent June 1st. On that morning, the Mustangs launched for an escort mission to Osaka, overruling the unit's own weather officers who had warned against it. The first portion of the flight went normally. Then, the lead navigational B-29, the aircraft these fighter pilots depended on to guide them across 600 miles of featureless ocean, was being flown by a navigator on his first trip anywhere near Japan. When a storm front appeared on the horizon, massive and black and extending in both directions as far as anyone could see, he didn't understand what he was looking at until it was too late to turn around. The Mustangs hit the front at full cruise speed. In seconds, visibility dropped to 0. Pilots reported they could not see their own wingtips. The turbulence was violent enough to snap formations apart instantly. The radios became a screaming wall of noise, voices calling out altitudes, calling out collisions, calling out bailouts, and then falling silent. Pilots reported spinning, recovering, spinning again. Some did not recover. Some recovered too low and flew into the water. Whole flights simply vanished, swallowed whole by the storm over the Pacific, and to this day there are no confirmed details about what happened to multiple men who were simply never seen again. Of the 148 aircraft that flew into that weather front, only 27 P-51s punched through to meet the bombers on the other side. One of them was First Lieutenant Robert Scamara. He arrived over Osaka alone, his wingman gone somewhere behind him in the storm. He found a formation of B-29s and flew escort by himself. He spotted a twin-engine Japanese interceptor moving towards the bombers, fired, knocked out its left engine and set it alight, crossed behind it and fired again to make sure and to get gun camera footage, since without a witness you got no credit for a kill. When he landed back on Iwo Jima 7 hours later and went to claim his kill, he was told his gun camera had been loaded incorrectly. No footage, no witness. Kill not confirmed. Except that a single B-29 gunner had reported seeing a Japanese fighter go down at precisely that location, and no other pilot had made a competing claim. The kill was confirmed. It was the only aerial victory the entire mission produced. The cost was 24 pilots lost, gone into the storm. It was the worst single day in the history of the Tokyo Club, and they called it exactly what it was, Black Friday. 9 days later, June 10th, they flew again. Over 100 Japanese fighters rose to meet them. The Americans shot down 24 of them and lost no one. The score had been settled. Through that summer, the Japanese pulled their remaining fighters back from frontline duty, conserving them for the invasion everyone knew was coming. The Tokyo Club shifted to low-level strafing, raking airfields, supply lines, and harbor shipping at deck level, the pilots close enough to see the faces of the men running below them. The color gun camera film from these missions survived, and the footage is remarkable. Mustangs threading between hangars, setting trains on fire, shredding anchored vessels while anti-aircraft fire reached up for them. On July 3rd, a Mustang pilot named Richard Schrompel was hit by ground fire over a Japanese harbor and barely got out of his aircraft before it burned. He landed in the water. Japanese guns on shore opened up on him while he floated in his life vest. American destroyers were en route. American Mustangs overhead immediately began suppressing the shore positions. A rescue aircraft dropped a raft. None of it arrived in time. Schrompel was hit and killed in the water, shot down not in a dogfight over Tokyo, but floating helpless while his friends circled above him and did everything they could. He was one of the last combat losses the Tokyo Club would suffer. By late July, the missions were becoming strange. Fewer Japanese interceptors appeared. The skies over the homeland were going quiet. On the very last mission of the war, as the Mustangs were flying home from a raid near Honshu, a voice came over the radio. The war, it said, was likely over. One pilot keyed his mic and replied, simply, "Well, the Japs sure as hell don't know it." They landed on Iwo Jima for the last time. In 6 months of combat operations, the very long-range Mustang units destroyed 452 Japanese aircraft in the air and on the ground. They protected the B-29s that were systematically dismantling Japan's capacity to continue the war. They flew the longest, most technically demanding fighter escort missions in the history of aerial warfare. The price was 130 Mustangs lost, 121 men killed or taken prisoner, a casualty rate that placed this particular assignment among the most lethal fighter postings of the entire war, higher than almost any other unit in any feeder. These were not men dying in the glamorous swirl of a famous campaign. Many of them died alone in the middle of the Pacific, far from any witness, their names appearing in reports as simply missing. But for those who came back, for every man who had buried a friend in the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima, who had hauled himself out of a cockpit after 9 hours over the ocean, who had looked down at Tokyo from the cockpit of an American fighter and understood what that meant, there was something that no statistic could measure. They had gone where no American fighter pilot had ever gone. They had fought over the enemy's capital and won, And they had done it in the final months of the war, when every mission mattered more than it ever had, and every man lost mattered more than words can easily say. To be a member of the Tokyo Club was to have been asked to do the impossible, and to have done it anyway. That, in the end, was what the rising sun had been forced to reckon with. Not just American industrial power, not just the weight of a nation finally fully committed, but these men. These specific men, flying their long way home across the Pacific, fuel gauges dropping toward empty, already thinking about who wasn't going to make it back. And who was.